because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot of enemies.
Welcome, everyone, to Science From the Fringe. My name is Bryce Nickels. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm honored to be joined today by Roger Pielke Jr. Roger is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on science and technology policy, the politicization of science, and energy and climate. He's also a professor emeritus at the University of Colorado Boulder, a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan, a research associate of Risk Frontiers in Sydney, Australia, and an honorary professor of the University College London. So, Roger, thank you very much for joining me today and getting up early. I know you're in Boulder right now. It's very early there.
Thanks for having me. It's great, and thanks for that very generous introduction.
Well, you've got a lot of titles. I'm glad that I was able to get through it, and I won't have to go back and edit it. So I wanted to talk to you today about several things. First, we're going to cover academic cancel culture and how that affected you. Then we're going to talk about weather modification and scientists playing God, and sort of link it to a subject that I'm interested in, which is, scientists playing God with viruses versus with the weather, as you're focused on. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you about, just mention that you have a very successful Substack, and it's called The Honest Broker. And you began this about 5 years ago, in fact, in October of 2020, to highlight data analysis and commentary that's missing from public discussions of science, policy, and politics. Can you tell us a little bit about why you started your Substack and where the name comes from?
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of a long story. In my research, my background's in mathematics and public policy, with a focus on science and technology policy, but I really focus on just one thing. I focus on contested science on issues that are politically contentious. So spent a lot of time in energy and climate. As you know, I've dabbled in the COVID virus origins discussions and debate, transgender athletes eligibility in elite competition. And my career started, I was on my way to get a PhD in the physical sciences, had a chance to spend some time working for the House Science Committee in Washington, D.C., and I got to see things from that perspective, and I realized, wow, this intersection of policy and science, for me, was just a lot more compelling and interesting than just doing science. And so I embarked on a career at science, technology, policy. Somewhere along the way, I decided, we social scientists, we spend a lot of time criticizing scientists for not engaging with the public or not engaging with the social science literature. And we publish our findings in esoteric, jargon-filled social science journals. So I decided to write a book. It was really kind of a field guide for experts trying to navigate policy and politics. And I titled that The Honest Broker, which is one of a number of categories I developed in that book for the relationship of scientists and policymakers. Basically said that our job, the most overlooked role, there's plenty of advocates out there, but the most overlooked role are people who can provide options to decision makers. Everyone knows what an honest broker is. You go to a travel website to see where to fly. You're not looking for advertisements. You're not looking for airlines who pay to have their ranking higher in the list. You just want to know, what are my options? When can I leave? How much does it cost? What are the stops in between? That's an honest broker. So I named my book that. And for my Substack, it's kind of an inside joke because honest brokering, I say, can't be done by an individual. It's a group activity. Yeah, we need to do it together. So we'll get into it, but flash forward, when I decided I was going to leave academia, one of the things you have to figure out is how you're going to pay the mortgage and things like that. So I was on sabbatical in Oslo, and as most people know, we academics get half a salary when we're on sabbatical. And I didn't take any other funding that year, and my wife and I lived just great. on half a salary. So I said for my Substack, if I can get to half my salary, then I'm out of here. I'm moving on. And so really it was an intentional attempt to try to do something different than being an academic, which we can talk about, has its very strong positives and, in my view, some very strong negatives. And The Honest Broker has been great. It's allowed me a lot of freedom to write what I want to write. It has surprisingly an enormous reach. And it also, I think, has facilitated my joining the American Enterprise Institute, which is an absolutely fantastic institution for academic freedom, and its connections and reach are unmatched.
Right, and I obviously recommend people subscribe to your Substack. It's really, I mean, I really enjoy your writing. Actually, is well, at least the stuff that I get for free because I'm not a paid subscriber now, Roger. I
You run,
apologize.
don't walk. Run, don't walk.
So you mentioned that your time in the academic space before you, and this is recent that you fully left and became an emeritus professor. Can you walk us through what exactly happened? And this is when I referred to academic cancel culture. You were, I would say, a victim of this. Can you kind of give us a bit of an overview of what happened to you and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, and let me just preface everything by saying I don't use the term cancel culture, and I certainly don't see myself as a victim. I mean, I have a greater platform today than probably I've ever had in my career. You know, my Substack has subscribers in 171 countries. Um, I'm out there, and so I don't view it that way. I view it that this is something that has happened to academia, and not to me. But it's a long story. I mean, I grew up on a college campus. My dad was a professor at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He'd take me to work on days I didn't have school when I was just a little kid, and he'd give me $1 to play video games and say, see you at 5. And I, wandered around the campus. I went to Alderman Library. I, looked at the murals in Clark Hall, and my favorite department was always astronomy. Walking around, and I thought, oh, I'm going to be a scientist one day. And so I love universities. I think that their mission is essential. It's important. I've always enjoyed teaching. So after I got my PhD, I got a postdoc at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which hired me as a scientist. And NCAR, for people who don't know, it's like a university without students. If for an early career scholar, it's a great place because you can just research, crank out publications, compile a really impressive resume. I was there for 8 years, and then the University of Colorado called and said, "Hey, we want you to come to the University of Colorado and start up a science and technology policy center." And for me, it was, an opportunity that I couldn't pass. So in 2001, I joined the University of Colorado. I was given two tasks. One was to start this new center, and one was to develop the graduate program in environmental studies, which I focused on environmental policy. Um, Everything went great, really until blogging started and the climate wars developed. Um, and we could get into this, but very quickly in the climate space, um, a small group of very visible climate scientists decided they needed to police the debate. And it was really about politics because there was a fear that if notions of uncertainty or a lack of consensus slipped into public discourse, it would slow down the chances of climate policy being enacted. And for people who may be aware of the climate issues, at the center of this was the hockey stick of Michael Mann. Um, and my work is on science and policy, and I don't see uncertainty as an obstacle to action. In fact, I think when scientists admit uncertainties, it reinforces public faith and policymaker belief. But long story short, climate science and climate politics became very partisan in my career. So I first got invited to testify before the U.S. Congress, I think in 2001. And for about a decade, I was only invited by Democrats. And then things shifted. I started to get invited by Republicans. And what I've always find curious is if you look at my testimony, not much has changed over that time. I think that the parties have kind of changed where they stand on the issue. Anyway, flash forward. In 2013, I testified before Congress. about extreme weather. There was a report that was released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on Extreme Weather Events, and I was asked to come testify and basically summarize in plain English for the elected representatives, what did this report say? And even at that time, the hype over extreme weather had gotten far out in front of where the IPCC was. And so I gave my little 5-minute opening statement. And I don't know how this happened or why this happened, but it went viral. Within 2 weeks, it got 400,000 hits on YouTube. And that got a lot of attention. And a few months later, President Barack Obama's science advisor, and I voted for Barack Obama 2 times, and I'd probably vote for him again if he was still able to run. His science advisor, John Holdren, testified before the same committee. And as we say here in Colorado, he got a little forward on his skis in what he was saying about extreme weather events, and he got called out by one of the members who unfortunately referenced my testimony in the IPCC. So John Holdren went back to the White House and he wrote a memo about me and posted it on the White House website. And it was the sort of thing like your crazy uncle might write and put on Facebook. Um, it, it didn't make a lot of sense. It didn't really address any of the points I made. It certainly didn't contradict the IPCC. But that put a target on my back. It wasn't much later, probably about 10 months later, my university got a letter from Congressman Raul Grijalva, who recently passed away, who asked the university to investigate me for my testimony. He said, we have reason to believe that Professor Pielke, and they sent letters to a few other scholars, Professor Pielke may be receiving money under the table from companies such as ExxonMobil in exchange for his testimony. So that, I was in the New York Times, I was in the local paper, professor investigated for financial irregularities. The university went through the investigation. I wasn't taking any money from Exxon or anybody else. My Ferraris, the plates did say XXON, but that was that was separate. Yeah. And it's a very common tactic. It still exists today in the climate debate. I'm sure you've seen it that when people disagree on normal, basic scientific questions, like how many hurricanes have there been, the immediate go-to response is, "Oh, you must be funded by the fossil fuel industry, or you must be a Republican," not recognizing that 85% of our economy is powered by fossil fuels, and it turns out the Republicans are in charge of all 3 branches of government right now. So if those things are illegitimate, that leaves a very little small sandbox to have policy discussions in. Anyway, at the moment that investigation was announced, things changed for me dramatically on campus. I thought it would have been a great opportunity for the university president to say, we value academic freedom. Professor Pielke, one of our most accomplished scholars, we stand behind his research. No, the only people I heard from during the entire time, really up to today about that investigation was from university lawyers who, gave me search keys to search through my email and asked for financial documents and things like that. And very quickly it started this, I guess, slow motion exit from the university. The first thing that happened was I was told that the center that I had been recruited to found and direct, the funding couldn't be guaranteed. Nobody said, "Oh, it's because of the investigation," but it's the world leading center on science technology policy. And so, I took the hint. And there's a long story. A lot of things happened, but I decided, all right, I'm gonna take a break from climate stuff, work on another one of my passions. So I talked to the athletic director at the Colorado Department of Athletics and said I wanted to start up an academic unit inside the athletic department. And we're going to focus on sports governance, and in particular, issues where science intersects with sport governance. And that included things like doping, gender eligibility in sport, the role universities have in college athletics, which has gone nuts. And that went well. That went really well. We started a great center. And then something similar happened. And I think this was because we started focusing a lot on the compensation of college athletes, which around 2017, 18 was not yet an accepted reality by university administrators. It's amazing to see where that's gone. Rutgers and Colorado have a lot in common there. Um, so the university, we're going to stop supporting this effort, and so you're going to go back to the environmental studies program. And while I had been developing the Sports Governance Center, the university literally lost its mind on climate politics. The faculty governance body had issued something like 5 or 7 statements about how we should orient all teaching in all departments on climate advocacy. And as I was someone who I'm a big supporter of climate policy, but the policies I support are somewhat different than what the environmental community supports. The decision to put me in the environmental studies program set up a situation where a few faculty members just didn't want me around. So things moved from there. I, I didn't get an office. When I asked for an office, they put me in literally a storage closet. No computer, no phone. And the pandemic happened. So what? You don't need an office. Yeah, I went with it. Um, Eventually, a new dean came and said, "Well, this is not tenable. We're gonna take Pielke out of the environmental studies program." But they didn't put me anywhere. They gave me an office. It was a good sized office in the stadium. I call it an island of misfit toys. Um, but I had no classes, no department, no way to have grad students, no way to have research funding, no service. Um, I I have joked often about it, like George Costanza working for the Yankees. Maybe I just show up and collect a paycheck. But I thought, all right, it's obvious they don't want me here. Nobody's going to do anything about it. I talked to all sorts of administrators, or at least I complained to them about my situation. Nobody was willing to do anything. And that's when I had one last sabbatical, which was a great time spent at the University of Oslo, which reminded me of what it's like to be in a collegial environment with colleagues who respect what you do and administrators who support you. And at that point, I decided, all right, there's this Substack thing. Seems to be taking off. This was 2020. Um, Maybe I should get on board. I was having kids during the .com era, so I missed all that. So I thought, all right, if I'm going to do the Substack thing, this is the time. And eventually I decided, I think it was when you have a sabbatical, you have to return for a year to campus. That's the contractual agreement. And after that, I said, all right, I'm going to leave. I was aiming to be the youngest emeritus professor in the U.S. And since then, I realized I missed it by a large mark. But I left the university before I was offered a position at AEI. I was fully thinking I'm going to be a my own scholar and do my own thing. I had an AEI affiliation as a non-resident fellow, but it wasn't a job. And AEI has been fantastic. Robert Doar, the president of AEI, has been probably the most supportive administrator I've ever worked for, over generations of university administrators. He repeatedly tells me, "You do what you do. Whatever it is you do it." And we respect that. And he says that to all the AEI scholars, and it's a diverse, intellectually healthy environment, which is obviously very close to policy. So when people say, "Well, you were canceled at the university," I guess in some respects, I was certainly pushed out. But if I had to go through, the last decade again to get to where I am today, I'd do it in a heartbeat. I have no regrets, none whatsoever. I hold my head up high about my time at the university. I think I made it a better place. And I still hear from former students, and I have grad students who are in important positions. So I'm, it's all good. I do think my story is a cautionary tale to university administrators, about the sort of things that can happen when you don't support academic freedom, intellectual diversity, and your faculty. I mean, sometimes I think administrators forget they work for us faculty members. We don't work for them. The faculty are the heart and soul of the university, and if you don't support them, you're going to find yourself in some trouble, and not just the sort of trouble that we see in the Trump administration, which we can talk about, which is pretty horrible in itself. Um, so, I mean, that's my story. And, I figure I published something a while ago that said that the median age of a tenured professor is 55. Um, I'm 56, so I figure, I'm mid-career still. I got a lot of gas in the tank.
Yeah, thanks for going through that. I find that really an interesting story in part because, actually, first of all, you neglected to say when you had the office in the stadium, weren't they redoing the scoreboard so you didn't get access to the stadium or to
Yeah,
your
I
office?
moved into the offices and I thought for a moment, I thought, okay, things are looking up. I got an office. I'm going to find a new department. I literally contacted, and I do science and policy, so I could be in a lot of different places, a lot of institutes on campus. I literally contacted a dozen places on campus. And a lot of places were like, "Yeah, we'll take you, but does this mean we're gonna have to sacrifice a future faculty line if we bring you in?" It was that sort of thing. I mean, no one was really concerned about the politics. It was more campus politics and budgeting, and without administrators willing to put me someplace. Um, so yes, I was told I was in my office for 3 months, my new office, center campus, and then I got a notification 3 days before Christmas. I think it was 23, 3 days before Christmas that said, uh, "Starting tomorrow, you won't have access to your office. We're putting a new video scoreboard in above it. There won't be any electricity, no heat. You can get back in next year." And, the university didn't give me any alternative arrangements, and that was one of the last straws when I thought, "Okay, well, message received."
But it was a nice office, which you couldn't access,
It was a
right? It
nice
was a
office.
very
I had a room for my books. I had a window, which I hadn't had for years, for a decade.
because when you were in the closet, I saw what you know what I mean. When you're in the closet office, the
Yep.
office that was closet, there was you published a photo where they started stacking up empty file cabinets in your office that they had removed from the climate center or whatever because they basically your story is a cautionary tale of or like it shows how because you had tenure how the universities sort of make it uncomfortable for you to be there when they don't want you there. It
Yeah,
seems to me.
there's one, I don't know what the right word is, campaigning, department chair whose mission apparently was to get me out of the university. Um, and yes, they moved in boxes and empty file cabinets into my little closet office, making it unusable. I didn't touch them because I didn't want them to accuse me of anything. And I asked for those to be removed, and no, of course not. Um, and then later, that administrator opened an investigation of me. Um, and the accusation was that I had received an NSF grant outside the university's, um, grant office. I mean, it's already difficult enough to go through the grant office. I don't know how any faculty member would get one outside the grant office. It was obviously false, but it consumed a year. Administrators took it seriously. It was that sort of constant low level, I would call it harassment that, was kind of the background of a, couple years there at the end.
Would you ever return to academia if you were offered a position? Would you consider that?
That's a good question. I have to say that with the Trump administration's attacks on universities and the idea that universities are full of lefties, which has some degree of truth to it, of course. Um, well,
Studies have shown that. I did
yeah,
speak to
I've
a
published a bunch of
professor.
that stuff, and,
Yeah,
it is
9 out of
true.
10.
I think I mean, I'm a pretty much a political centrist. I was registered as an independent when I turned 18 and always been independent. And, people on the right love my climate change work, and people on the left love my transgender athlete stuff. So, pick what you want. I'm happy to talk about my politics to anybody. But I think by virtue of me being at AEI and being fairly visible, um, I've been contacted by more universities in 2025 about possible faculty positions than, over the last 10 years. Um, the short answer is at present, no. I can't even imagine going back to a university. Maybe there are some universities where things are happening. Um, Johns Hopkins is one of them, Vanderbilt's another, um, where university leaders recognize that universities, have kinda lost their way in some respects, and I'd be happy to talk about that. Um, but at present, I can't imagine. The only thing that I miss being at a university, that I have now, is working with students closely. And at an AEI, I taught an honors class this past summer, which is fantastic. Great students. They get the pick of the litter. They get fantastic students. They come to class prepared, look me in the eye, shake my hand, connect with me on LinkedIn after the first class. I mean, it's do all the readings. So I do miss that. But at this point, I don't need research funding. And honestly, I'm senior enough, I don't need tenure. So it wouldn't, my choices wouldn't be, I think, for everyone who's thinking about academia. I want academia to work. I want it to be improved. AEI has an effort on reforming U.S. universities that I'm affiliated with. And in my position, I get to meet with a lot of university leaders. So I intend to be fully engaged with the university ecosystem, but returning to a faculty position doesn't look in the cards right now. And I've often said it publicly, I can't think of a worse job on the planet than being a university administrator. So I don't think that that's for me.
Well, look, I am trying to arrange a new professorship. It's called the ExxonMobil Professor of Climate at Rutgers, and so maybe we could consider you for that position. That's a joke. Just kidding. But what I was going to point out is I find your story quite fascinating. You started like two centers, right? Two successful centers. Like you were doing way more than the average faculty member. In fact, like it seems like you were innovating and doing all these things that I thought that university professors are supposed to do, and that kind of made you, in some ways, like a bit of a pariah. It's almost like they want mediocrity, and so they push out somebody that's innovative and think and actually ahead of their time in a way. Not to I'm not trying to blow smoke here. It just seems like you started two successful things, and that the sports governance program, like that's really interesting. I actually had thought about doing some sort of like sports science thing back when I was involved with my kids, athletics. I really thought there was some, linking, taking scientific approaches and applying them to athletics would be something a university would be interested in. You, in fact, you did something. And you should have been celebrated for it, but instead they gave you a closet, stacked some file cabinets in, and then sort of slowly moved you out. So I commend you on sort of sticking with it. And I mean, congratulations on being in a place right now where you're happier and, kind of, probably it's a blessing. Sounds like that it really, in a way, was a blessing that happened to you because it seems like you found your lane and the place that's most appropriate for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I do think there is, and I'd be interested in your views on this too. At most universities, especially, what we call R1 or the leading research universities, there's this rush to mediocrity. The idea that you don't want to be the university that's out in front. Um, you don't want to be seen to be the one that's out in front. You want to copy something that's been done elsewhere. I mean, our sports governance center, I am tremendously proud of that. I think to this day, that is the uh, only institutionalized effort at any Division I sports university where a tenured professor was rostered in an athletic department. Um, I taught classes that were rostered from the athletic department. And then, the classes that I taught, it wasn't, you know, underwater basket weaving for athletes trying to stay eligible. They were rigorous classes that were enormously popular. Um, I had, visitors from around the world come to those classes. I had people calling me up to visit. Lance Armstrong came, Hope Solo came to my classes. Had, players from the NFL, administrators from the NCAA. Chris Fowler came. I mean, it was a very successful effort, but it was also the only one of its kind in the nation. And I do think administrators in particular, look over their shoulder. Like, why are we doing this? But the peers that we look up to aren't doing this sort of thing. And so that was probably one of the greatest frustrations. And the other one was, and you probably see this on campus politics is, I mean, you set aside, left, right, Republican, Democrat stuff. Campus politics are extremely pathological for universities, and really get in the way of universities achieving their mission, which is teaching research and professional service. That's it.
Honestly, just listening to you tell that story, it's just very frustrating. Like you say, mediocrity is celebrated, and people that sort of think out of the box I mean, I guess maybe you were a victim of academic marginalization. Let's not call it cancel culture. Let's call it academic marginalization. I would maybe put it as they didn't get you. Maybe they were, I don't know. It seems like they just maybe were jealous in some ways. I don't know. Who knows what the motivations were, but it does seem like people like yourself that used to make up the major portion of the faculty would be, I think, maybe people like yourself that were, thinking beyond themselves and looking to do new stuff, has been replaced by most people sort of siloed into their own little small lane of expertise, and they get afraid when they see people sort of doing more innovative things. I could be wrong, and this partially is a bit of my own frustration
Right, right.
myself.
I do have a theory. I mean, it is unique to the University of Colorado, and I want to be charitable to the university and its people. I mean, there's a lot of good people there and a lot of good administrators trying to do good things. Um, but at the same time, there's a lot of people who, um, probably are focused on mediocrity or just getting ahead inside the university environment. But unique to the University of Colorado, I'm a policy professor. I teach policy. Um, Colorado's maybe the largest university in terms of budget in this country without a dedicated policy school or policy program. And the culture of doing policy research um, is different than doing hypothesis-driven statistical social science or measuring the mass balance of glaciers. When you do policy research, guess what? You are out there in the public talking about things that people care about and are political. And the fact that the University of Colorado has never had an administrator who really has the sense of what we do in policy research meant that I was always going to be kind of viewed as kind of a foreign entity on campus. And so at a Science Policy Research Center, our job wasn't to advocate for science budgets. Our job was to ask difficult questions of complicated science technology issues. Are the research portfolios that we're spending money on, are they fit for purpose to inform policymakers on climate change? And Colorado is one of the universities that has one of the biggest research budgets for climate change research. So here you have a professor poking around and saying, "Hey, maybe our priorities aren't in line." You know this. I mean, it's a little bit like asking, like, "Well, should we be doing gain of function research?" Well, if you're a gain of function researcher, you don't want anybody poking around asking those sort of busybody questions. Um, in sports governance, if you're going to talk about the eligibility of transgender athletes, guess what? People are going to get upset, and that's okay because that's the nature of policy and policy research. So I do think that there was a cultural clash there, and had there been administrators at Colorado who, or even an institution, a school of public policy, where we have a few dozen researchers who do this, and it's just perfectly normal. I mean, any day, pick up the paper and you'll see someone from, the Ivy Leagues or University of Chicago or California schools talking about policy. Um, and that some people will complain about them, and that's okay. That's what academic freedom is for. That's why universities exist, to provide a place where we can have these difficult discussions about things that are contentious in the public sphere.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point that maybe your situation happened to be worse because of the institution you have wasn't really something wasn't set up to handle a person that was so heavily involved in policy, particular policy around climate. And that actually is a good transition to what I wanted to talk to you about, which was your recent congressional testimony in a hearing titled Playing God with the Weather, a Disastrous Forecast. So as you mentioned before, you've testified in front of Congress numerous times. How many times would you estimate that you've given testimony
It's a
as
good
a policy?
question. I would say 15 plus or minus some 2 or 3.
Okay, so can you give us a bit of a overview of what this latest hearing was about? What's the background on why this hearing was called? Like, when did you first learn about it? And when were you asked to testify?
Congressional hearings are super interesting, and they're part of the way that the Congress establishes a record, of a substantive record, on topics that they care about. And, the way that it works is the majority gets to invite a majority of the witnesses, and the minority gets to invite, 1 or 2. Um, And usually, you have to be clear-eyed about this. You are invited as a witness because the staff and the members think there's some political advantage to having you testify. And that's just the way that it is. Um, I was invited to this hearing, like almost every hearing. The staff calls you up a couple weeks before and says, we're thinking about having this hearing. Um, it's a little bit, for many people, if they get called for the first time, they're kind of feeling you out, like, who are you? What do you sound like? What are your perspectives? I'm kind of a known quantity in a lot of places these days. Um, and I have written on what's called geoengineering. In my book, The Climate Fix, I had a chapter discussing geoengineering. I wrote a paper on the economics of geoengineering. Geoengineering is the idea we're going to put uh, aerosols or particulates into the stratosphere, which is the super high atmosphere above where the weather occurs, to dim the sun in order to cool the planet. Um, and I am a signatory to an international statement put together by a group in Europe calling for a geoengineering non-use treaty. The idea that governments around the world should come together and say, we're not going to be tinkering with the stratosphere, with trying to blot out the sun for a lot of reasons. But, the main one is, you know, we're not omniscient enough to know what the consequences might be. And there could be some really bad consequences. And we're already messing with the climate inadvertently by emitting carbon dioxide through the use of fossil fuels. So let's not, you know, compound that mistake by putting uh, stuff up in the stratosphere. So the chair of the subcommittee, it was the Doge subcommittee of the House Oversight Committee, is Marjorie Taylor Greene, and there is this confusing mix-up between weather modification. So this is efforts to seed clouds to get more rainfall or snow, which has been done for the last 70 years with what I would argue is little knowledge of its effectiveness. Geoengineering, and there are conspiracy theories that sit alongside that, focus on what are called chemtrails. The idea that people look up and they see aircraft contrails and they think, oh, that's the government changing the weather. And to be honest, um, Chair Green has promoted some of those conspiracy theories. So for me, it was an opportunity to come testify and try to clarify what the science says and doesn't say about weather modification, geoengineering. And I didn't talk much about chemtrails because I think it's not really worth talking about. Another witness, Chris Martz, basically debunked that idea. So for me, anytime you're invited to testify before Congress, I look at it on two levels. One is opportunity to participate in the democratic process, to interact with the legislators and their staff. That's important. But also it's an opportunity for me to prepare my testimony. That is a written testimony that's going to be part of the congressional record for the rest of time. And so I take a lot of time to prepare that because the audience for my testimony goes well beyond the members who are sitting there that day. And so I tried to put together a very careful summary of what the science says and doesn't say about weather modification and geoengineering, drawing on, peer-reviewed consensus science, reports of the Government Accountability Office, Congressional Research Service. And so for me, it was a great opportunity. But, the hardest thing is that, number one, they usually give you about a week or 10 days to, basically write a report. And the other thing is you have to sit there in front of them and be ready to answer any question about anything. And it's been a while since I have been personally attacked by a member of Congress. But there was a time 10 or 15 years ago, the former congressman from California, Henry Waxman, had a go at me, which it's fine. It's their right. It's their time. Um, but I felt like at this hearing, the members asked serious questions and they took the issue seriously.
And so I guess a couple things about what you just said. One is with relation to, so you're talking about chemtrail? What do you call it? Contrail? What is the actual term?
So the conspiracy theory is focused on a word called chemtrails, CHEM,
Chemtrails.
like chemical trails.
Right. But maybe, okay, so this has come up. One reason I wanted to bring this up was I I guess I do find it worth sort of mentioning that there were experiments that were done by the United States government back in the 50s and 60s, not related to weather modification, but where they actually sprayed chemical, containing bacteria, or actually it was chemicals, and then in some cases chemicals mixed with, what they thought weren't going to be dangerous bacteria over populations both in the US and Canada. And then they didn't admit it for many, many years later. So with that history, it's not surprising to me that members of the public would find, it, I guess I'd say, how do you convince members of the public that there aren't efforts to modify the weather by dispersing agents from planes when there is a history, at least, where the government has done similar things, like not to modify weather, but to experiment with what a biological agent or a chemical agent attack, how that would, that agent would disperse on populations.
I mean, in my testimony, I referenced, and this was an effort to modify the weather. There was a secret program that the military had during the Vietnam War, or Laos in Vietnam, to try to seed clouds, to basically flood and muck up the jungle, so it was more difficult for the Viet Cong to move. Yeah, I mean, so it is a problem when the government projects are intransparent or secret. It creates an unhealthy suspicion that can go very wild places. I mean, the notion that that commercial airlines are working with the government to load up planes with chemicals to try to alter the weather, is one of the more easily debunked conspiracy theories that are out there. I mean, the we've been trying to modify the weather as a country and around the world. I don't know what the number is. I think it was like 60 countries have weather modification programs. But if you look at the peer-reviewed literature, there is absolutely no consensus about the effectiveness of these projects. There's some sense of the theoretical effectiveness. Um, so the idea, number one, that the government could organize itself in such a way to effectively modify the weather, gives government a lot too much credit for for what is possible. But scientifically, it's pretty straightforward to debunk that, and it is kind of a fringe theory. That said, there are scientists, and there was one that testified at this hearing, who are all gung ho about injecting particles in the stratosphere to modify the weather. And so, maybe that's adjacent to this chemtrail theories. Um, but having Dr. Strangelove like approaches to tinkering with the Earth system is not far-fetched. So one of the things I recommended in my testimony, there is a tabulation, a record, um, that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has, NOAA, for weather modification projects, but it's almost impossible to sort through it. It's hard to find. There needs to be much more radical transparency about efforts to modify the climate and the weather, let the sunshine in. And there also has to be some regulation. I think it's important for the government to say, here are things we are not going to do. And that's why I signed on to the non-use treaty for geoengineering, so that people know. I feel the exact same way. And I had a chance to testify or prepare testimony on gain of function research, proximal origins, and all that. It's the same thing with regulating, potentially harmful, dangerous biological research.
Right. Can you talk about the connection there? I was going to ask you that later, but since you brought it up now, can you discuss the parallels you see in the sort of climate scientists that are trying to modify the weather, and also the gain of function virologists? And perhaps maybe if you also want to mention, you did say in your testimony there's issues with like the terminology and the way that language is used to sort of muddy the waters, so to speak, in your space or in the space of like weather modification. There's also a use and deliberate misuse of language to sort of muck up, the gain of function debates. I don't know if you see a parallel with that as well, but
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I mean, if I use the phrase gain of function research of concern, half your listeners are going to go to sleep. And it's a sort of turgid um, jargonization of what should be more transparent and open discussions. Um, so weather modification and geoengineering have different definitions, what falls under them. What's an experiment? What's implementation? I had a few comments after my testimony that said, well, what you're talking about are experiments. It's not really implementation. Um, and these are just words. I mean, if you're doing research on dangerous viruses, sure, call it an experiment. You're not rolling it out, operationally. Um, but you still could have some pretty bad stuff that actually results from it.
Wait, so they're saying that this is okay because it's happening basically on a small scale? Is that the idea that like a research project that's just being done in a field somewhere is not weather modification because it's not affecting, like it's not done like across the globe or something? Is that what
That's
they're
yes,
doing with
that's one argument that's made is that, well, we're not implementing it at a global scale, but we do want to tinker with the atmosphere or the ocean, or clouds in certain places, because if we want to have that in our toolbox in the future, then we need to actually go out in the field and see what the effects are. It is an
that's geoengineering? The term geoengineering refers to if you do this at scale and weather modification. So what terms are used
this
in
is
the
part of the confusion and inflation. So at one level, geoengineering, you could think geo Earth engineering refers to the big picture, like we're engineering the planet. Um, but what do you call it if you decide, oh, we want to put some particles up in the stratosphere, um, just over the west coast of the U.S. and just see what the effects are? Is that geoengineering? Is that a geoengineering experiment? Is that a precursor to geoengineering? This
I'd call it stupid. I'd call it idiotic,
Yeah,
but that's
I
an
you know, I that's why I signed the non-use. I think it's a bad idea to begin with. But this is why regulation and transparency are absolutely necessary. Um, and part of the problem is that some of the most forceful, strong advocates for engineering experiments are those researchers who would be conducting geoengineering experiments. And there's not a lot of people who have expertise in this field who are not those who are actively involved in potentially doing this work. I see a lot of parallels with gain of function research in biology, basically doing virology research to make viruses more potent in some respect, and then seeing what the effects are. Um, and there too, I think that there should be pretty strong regulations on what's allowed and what's not allowed. Um, and I mean, another area of parallel, and this is kind of more of a science policy issue, is that the scientific publication process um, breaks down on some of these highly contested issues. And I see a lot of that in climate research. I publish on that. I've also written extensively on proximal origins, and the sort of violations of both the formal rules of academic publication, but also the norms associated with publication.
Roger, I did want to interject. So one is, if people aren't familiar with it, so the proximal origins refers to a paper that came out in March of 2020 called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, which was, I mean, Roger and I both agree, was a fraudulent paper that was designed to mislead the public on the origin of COVID. You, in fact, were scheduled to testify at a hearing that involved, well, they invited three journal editors, Richard Horton, and I think, what's the woman who's the head of Nature?
Magdalene Skipper.
Her, and Holden Thorpe. And Holden Thorpe was the only one that appeared. And although you were scheduled to testify, they canceled on you at the last minute, right?
Yeah, I think they wanted me to be there as kind of a researcher who studies science policy who wasn't the head of a journal, because they had three journal. And once the Lancet and Nature canceled their participation, then they didn't want it to be mano a mano with Thorpe. So they said, you can prepare your testimony and submit it, and we'll just talk to Thorpe. So it's their dime. But my testimony was published. It's in the record. I published it also. And in that testimony, I go through some of the issues associated with decisions made about publishing papers that I think were intended to manage a narrative about COVID origins. And you don't, this is a science policy question. It's not a question of the substance of the paper. For instance, when you have the head of the Wellcome Trust participating in preparing the paper, and orchestrating its publication, but doesn't show up as a co-author. It raises some questions about, are we engaged in PR here, or is this a research effort?
So you're referring to the fact that for the proximal origin paper, Jeremy Farrar, who at the time was the head of the Wellcome Trust, was involved in, you can see there's a record very clearly he was involved in this paper, even edited the paper, and does not show up as an author. And in fact, in communications between the authors, it says, we can't have him on here because it'll look bad, basically. That's in clear violation of the journal's policies on authorship, and yet they do nothing. And so what you're saying, you see similar dynamics in the climate science, is what you're saying, like in terms of the way the journals manage publications, is that we saw at least with COVID origin.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example, and this involves some of my research. There's a fake data set on the economic losses associated with hurricanes that's kind of worked its way into the peer-reviewed literature. The fake data set is based on an actual real peer-reviewed data set that I and my colleagues put together, that someone modified and put it online, and some researchers found it online and said, hey, here's an Excel file, let's do research with it. And I had been in touch with multiple journal editors to notify them, hey, you published a few papers that are pretty visible, they're cited by the IPCC, and they are using a fake data set. And partly, I think, because the resulting research conforms to a particular narrative, that journals have refused to do anything about it. One journal invited me to write a response, and I documented it and responded. But if this, in this case, just like proximal origins, if these instances are not the basis for retraction of published research, then really nothing is, and anything goes.
I think we don't need journals. I've been very public about saying we don't need journals. Do you agree with that, or do you have a different, more nuanced view?
Yeah, I'm not willing to go that far. I do think, like universities, journals should work, and they should work better. There has been this proliferation of journals, such that wherever something is published, trust but verify. When I get, a research study, it's a lot of work to go in and say, all right, is this something that looks solid? A lot of the work I've done over the last decade has involved the misuse of climate scenarios, which is its own podcast show. And you really have to be an expert in the field to be able to see that misuse. And if you just blindly trust what's being produced, um, the scientific literature will be distorted, public discussion will be corrupted, and policymakers are going to get a very misleading view as to reality. So I do think some form of quality control is needed. The journals historically have existed to provide that. That has broken down. And if we don't have journals, we'll need schmernals, or, it's just something that's similar and plays the same function.
We have preprint servers already. So we have places where people can post results, and then those can provide forums for, review or, debate. I don't know. That's my sort of reason why we don't need the journals, as a way of giving this artificial gold stamp, or, a
Right.
gold star of approval. That's where I see the issues, where the journals are used to platform misleading information and make it seem like it's fact,
Right.
whereas it's actually science fiction.
I think most people, even in the scientific community, don't realize how cursory peer review is, and also how easily peer review is corrupted by an editor picking, friendly or unfriendly reviewers. I can point to many instances. I think preprint servers are absolutely fantastic. And I can tell you that the analysis, I do a lot of analyses that I publish on my Substack. I get more peer review publishing initial analyses on Substack than I ever got on any published peer review paper. By the time I decide to put my analyses together to submit to a journal, it has already gone through a much more rigorous peer review than I'm going to get from the 3 or 4 reviewers the journal puts on it. So um, this has been called, in science technology studies, the notion of extended peer review. The idea that putting claims out for public scrutiny by experts, whoever wants to comment, is a much more robust way of ensuring reliable knowledge than simply relying on journals.
That's interesting to learn that. I mean, it makes sense to me that when you have a Substack like yours and you're putting out original, research, original ideas, that you would get a lot of feedback. And that is a much better way of doing it than the current journal system,
Right.
and it's way more transparent, and all the public can join into those, or at least perhaps just the paid subscribers, right? Is it just paid subscribers that can comment, or
So,
can we?
so at my Substack, it's only paid subscribers who can comment.
Okay.
And
All right. So there's a little gatekeeping, Roger, a little gatekeeping. Maybe every Tuesday we can let in the free. No, just kidding. I think it's worth, by the way, even though look, I'm just cheap. I'm just cheap. So I have not subscribed, but others should definitely. But I want to go back to your testimony before I let you go. I wanted to ask you, did you talk to Marjorie Taylor Greene about like some of the things that she said that are incorrect, or is that, I don't know. Where do things stand? Like, I mean, I do think it's a problem if we have lawmakers that are, and I don't necessarily think I mean, it could be deliberate, it could not be. A lot of times it's just misunderstanding things because it's really hard to understand certain aspects of science. And also, it's very easy to believe certain things based on, the track record of government secrecy and whatnot. Did you get anywhere trying to convince her that chemtrails aren't, or at least some of the things she said about them are not correct?
Yeah, so this is the only time I met Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I would say, politically, our Venn diagram probably doesn't have a big overlap. Um, and I met her before the hearing and interacted with her during the hearing. A lot of the things she said about weather modification and geoengineering were eminently sensible and reasonable. If you take a look at her opening statement and her closing statement, there's a lot of things in there that I would say were pretty unreasonable. And so I do think in 2025 politics, um, you have elected officials who are entire whole persons with nuanced views and, what they have their politics. But there's also the TV version of these politicians. I can tell you there were multiple members of that committee who showed up and they have their 5 minutes, who entirely were speaking to the cameras. But they weren't there to talk to the witnesses or learn about geoengineering. At the same time, there were other members who looked me in the eye and asked me substantive questions. So, so I do think a lot of the politics of 2025 is performative. And the nature of our politics, this is another podcast, but the nature of our politics rewards the extremes on the right and the left. So MAGA versus the progressives is the political battle, but in reality, most everybody in this country is, center right, center left, centrist. They're not at the extremes. So that's a more fundamental problem. But I do hope that she listened to me and the other witnesses, because I think overall the prepared testimony for that hearing was pretty good.
I actually think Marjorie Taylor Greene's quite effective at platforming specific issues. So whether her style is one that sort of rubs certain people the wrong way, like sometimes she brings the room. Like I mean, in particular at Anthony Fauci's hearing, when she spoke, all the cameras started going off. She commanded that room, and she spoke about the Beaglegate controversy that Fauci was involved in, and that really, even people that weren't fans of her, I think, really appreciated that she was one of the few at that hearing that took him to task.
Yeah, let me just say that she is politically enormously effective. And there's a lot of Donald Trump politically is enormously effective. I'm a policy nerd. I would like to see much more policy content associated with political effectiveness. And to the degree that politics and policy get separated, which I think they are in large degree, and on the right and the left right now, it's hard to get good policy out of that. You just get.
Would you ever run for office, Roger? What about that?
So I was the student body president of my high school senior year.
Breaking news.
Yeah.
We didn't know this. The
Yeah.
secret.
And that I decided was my last political campaign. So
Okay. I guess, okay, so one thing I do want to know is what comes out of these hearings. So what do you expect will come out of this hearing? Is this just to make, get a little bit of a news cycle, or will there be anything substantive that comes out of this recent hearing?
yeah, so I guess one of the things, and I would recommend this to all my peers, is to not think about participation in a hearing as a chance to have impact. or measurable outcomes. Part of it is you are participating in the democratic process where claims, counterclaims are aired out in public, and elected officials get to challenge those claims. Um, in all the hearings I've participated in, the vast majority, I would say, after the stone dropped in the pond and the ripples went away, who knows what effect it had. Some of them, however, like the one I participated in 2013, where I gave the same testimony before the House and the Senate. It had enormous impact, and not just among members of the committee, but publicly. It also led to some of the issues in my career. But I mean, this is what another warning I have to my peers. If you want to participate in the political process, guess what? Politics ain't beanbag, and you're going to become a political object yourself. And that's the price you pay for having some degree of influence. So, so for me, the fact that members of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have at different times seen my views as valuable gives me a platform to talk to my peers, to talk to the public, to talk to the media in a way that I think is, it's goes along with being a public intellectual in modern America. Is you're part of a big messy conversation, and if you're fortunate enough, people at least hear you out.
One more question about the hearing and about science policy related to it. The one parallel that we neglected to discuss as it relates to gain-of-function virology and climate modification is the fact that a scientist doing an experiment in one nation can have impacts on populations living in other nations. Which isn't that a violation of doesn't that seem to violate a lot of sort of tenets of just nations, like governance of nations or something? Um, what what is how do you see, like, are there other nations that are modifying the climate right now? Is there evidence for that? And if so, what can, the United States do about that?
So, I mean, there's precedent here. So there are um, international agreements and prohibitions on nuclear weapons research, for example, under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And this is one reason why I and colleagues have called for a geoengineering non-use. Um, One of the recommendations I made at the hearing is that we need to ensure that we have monitoring systems, specifically satellite systems that have the ability to detect if a private company or another nation is tinkering with the atmosphere or the Earth system in some way, ideally under such a treaty to ensure compliance with it. Um, there is no doubt that a billionaire or the Chinese government or some other actor could decide they want to tinker with the Earth system. And so it is. I see it very much like you know gain of function research. There's nothing to stop some country from working in a low level biosafety lab to do dangerous experiments. The technology exists, and so that is something that arguably we've already seen could affect everybody on the planet. And so this is probably one of the most compelling areas for international agreements to regulate scientific research that has potential for widespread harm. And we already do it with nuclear weapons, so we should do it in other areas that could be just as dangerous.
How scared should the public be about this issue? Like, how concerned should we be about ourselves or other nations doing weather modifications experiments that cause harm?
So on weather modification, specifically trying to enhance precipitation, um, I don't think there's too much concern people should have because we don't even know how effective it is. I think we should be concerned that we're spending money doing it and we don't know if it works. Geoengineering, I think there should be some low level concern. Um, I don't think there's a lot of appetite that I see right now around the world to modify the climate. All the talk about the notion of climate as an existential threat, and that we need to act immediately to turn down the temperature. Um, Countries aren't acting like that in the real world. I am far more concerned about your field and dangerous virology research. I do think it's highly likely that COVID emerged from a research-related incident. It's not the first we've seen, and I think the consequences So think about it like this. COVID, if you look at some of the economic estimates of the impact of COVID globally on the economy, pick your favorite number, but it's measured in the tens of trillions of dollars. Changes to climate over many, many decades, taking the most scary worst case scenarios, are in the tens of trillions of dollars. So a global pandemic could, in a very short period of time, kill more people than climate change over the next 100 years, even in the worst scenarios, and have economic consequences far more devastating. So I think, whatever any of us thinks the probability of an event is, the consequences related to a pandemic are just so much greater, which is why I have much greater concerns. Because, one slip up and, it could be an extremely big deal.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, I guess, and obviously it's been something that I've the last several years been heavily involved in, and I'm hoping with the recent, statements made by President Trump in front of the United Nations, where he said that the United States would want to have other nations join us in stopping bioweapons research, and the executive order that he signed in May, that we're finally making some progress, real meaningful progress on this front. All right, final question, and it's about a hearing that you didn't participate in, but I believe you attended, which was about the hearing for Anthony Fauci's former special advisor, David Morenz, which took place in May of 2024. If I recall, you labeled that as the most ridiculous or absurd or comical hearing that you've ever attended. Is that correct?
I said something I don't think I said comical. I said it's one of the most remarkable hearings. Yeah. I had testified on the Senate side that same day, so I was able to walk over and sit there right behind him in person and watch it, since I follow this issue pretty closely. This is one, I mean, the story well, but this is one where Mr. Morenz was confronted with, his own emails, talking about evading Freedom of Information Act requests, and I don't remember the exact words, but that Anthony Fauci had a secret channel, and saying things, and then having the members of Congress, and kudos to the members and their staff for being well prepared, just contradicted what he said in such a way that I could not believe that he was not better prepared to answer questions about, whether it was through Freedom of Information Act or congressional investigations, information that had come out that were pretty bad for him. And so as witnesses, you have to know the field of play. And it seemed to me like he was thoroughly unprepared. I'm not sure where the status of the congressional investigations are. They do seem like they've slowed down since the last Congress. But there's a lot that U.S. government officials and people who oversaw research and research funding still have to answer for. And that hearing was one. Part of what was remarkable about that is that when that investigation started, origins of COVID related issues, it was very partisan. You could tell, the statements at the very beginning, the first witnesses, that Republicans and Democrats weren't very close. At that hearing, my interpretation was that if you look at the questions and statements being made by the members, you couldn't tell who was a Republican, who was a Democrat. The members were kind of knocked off their partisan positions by the fact that the evidence was so overwhelming that whatever the origins were, there were some shenanigans going on in the U.S. government, and the witness, Mr. Morenz, was, kudos to him. He brought Democrats and Republicans together in a way that not a lot of witnesses can.
Well, that's one way of looking at that. I remember your comments at the time, which I found, and that hearing was a thing of, as you say, I guess it was remarkable.
Yeah.
But thanks a lot, Roger, for joining me today. And good luck with, continuing to grow your Substack, and maybe we'll see you back in academia at some point, or maybe we'll, see you. I know you said you don't want to, but I do see a potential political future for you. If you'd like that, you can do a lot of things. I appreciate you joining me. And until next time, this has been Science from the Fringe.